Now, from Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C., Justin Martin discusses his new biography of consumer advocate and 2000 presidential candidate Ralph Nader. It's about an hour.
Please help me welcome Justin Martin. Well, it's a pleasure to be here at Politics and Prose to talk about Ralph Nader, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. So look around the audience, I see some friendly faces, including my cousins who live here in Washington, D.C., and some old friends from college and other times of my life. So welcome everybody, and thanks for coming out. And thought what I'd do is I'd start by providing kind of a thumbnail sketch of Ralph Nader's early years. Then I'm going to talk for a while about a particular period in his history. Then I'll read a brief excerpt that relates to that period in time. And then I'll be happy to entertain any and all questions. We can talk about the 2000 election. We can talk about the 2002 midterms. Whatever people want to talk about, I'll be happy to entertain questions. So starting with the sort of brief thumbnail sketch of his early years, Ralph Nader was born on February 27, 1934 in Winsted, Connecticut. His parents were Lebanese immigrants, and his father, upon arriving in the United States, for 1 year before settling in Winsted, Connecticut, he lived in Detroit. And while he was in Detroit, he worked on the assembly line of Maxwell Auto Company. And Maxwell Auto Company was later rechristened Chrysler. And when Ralph Nader was growing up, at the dinner table, he often was regaled by his father with stories of the degradations of working on the assembly line of Maxwell Auto Company, and people can make of it what they will as to whether that had any kind of influence in his later life as an auto safety crusader. Ralph Nader has two sisters, Claire and Laura. Claire Nader is a advocate kind of in a Ralph Nader type of vein. Her area of interest is genetic testing, patenting of genes, those types of issues, and as you can imagine, she's against it. Ralph Nader's other sister, Laura, is an anthropology professor at Berkeley, and Laura's area of expertise is victims' rights. Ralph Nader also had a brother named Shafiq. Shafiq was, when I interviewed people, they often described him as being to the town of Winsted, Connecticut, where they grew up, what Ralph Nader was to the rest of the country. He was a very vocal gadfly. He was always complaining at town meetings about the sewer system. He was always trying to shoot down various local ordinances. And Shafiq died in 1986. Ralph Nader went to Princeton University undergrad, and he attended at the same time as Donald Rumsfeld. And Rumsfeld at that time was kind of a big man on campus. He was on the wrestling team. And during one of my interviews with Ralph Nader, he described Rumsfeld as the smug wrestler. While Ralph Nader was at Princeton, he owned his last car he would ever drive, which was an old Studebaker. One time he was driving around on campus, and this kind of abstracted-looking man with flowing white hair kind of wandered out into the line of his car. Ralph Nader had to slam on the brakes. He stopped right before this person, looked up through his front window, and there standing before him was Albert Einstein. And he thought to himself, what if the brakes hadn't worked? I would have run over one of the great minds of the 20th century. And again, you can make of it what you will as to whether that had some influence on his later decision to become an auto safety crusader. He did get rid of the Studebaker not too long after that. Let's see, after Princeton undergrad, Ralph Nader went on to Harvard Law School. He never felt comfortable there. He never has had a sort of ambivalent relationship towards the school. And in the years since then, he's often described Harvard as a high-priced tool factory. Now after graduating Harvard Law, he went back to Connecticut, back to Hartford, and he practiced what can only be described as penny ante law. He was doing divorce cases, trust. He was in a little tiny firm with just one other person. He was doing some ambulance chasing even. It was just very low-level law. At the same time, he was developing an interest, sort of as a sideline, in a topic that at that time was very, very esoteric, which was the role that engineering could play in auto safety. And it's kind of hard to believe, but during this era, the prevailing belief was that all the engineering innovations possible had been made with respect to cars. The only thing that could be done, the only improvements that could be made, were for people to drive more carefully, safer driving. Ralph Nader was of the belief, and it was a fringe view, that maybe there are innovations, things that we've come to take for granted, like seat belts, safety glass, collapsible steering columns, that maybe if you could package drivers within the cars better, even if they're a sloppy driver, they might be saved in an accident. Now, in 1964, Ralph Nader got the opportunity to go down to Washington and work with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who's one of the handful of people who also subscribe to this kind of esoteric view about the role that engineering could play in safety. And while Ralph Nader was down in Washington, working with Moynihan, he sort of laid the groundwork, for Unsafe at Any Speed, which came out in the autumn of 1965. And looking back, people probably might think that Unsafe at Any Speed was just an instant sensation. But in fact, it was a very serious book. It was taken very seriously. It was reviewed in some places like Science Magazine and San Francisco Chronicle. And people sort of did a lot of discussion of how it was an important book, and it was destined to sink without a ripple had it not been for the fact that one of the parties named in the book, pointed to in the book, General Motors, was very concerned about Ralph Nader's pointing to them for their what he asserted was faulty engineering in the production of the Corvair. And so they assigned a couple of spies to tail him around Washington, D.C. Also, Nader had some strange experiences when he went into a Safeway at one point, also at a newsstand at one point, where he was accosted by women. And Ralph Nader had the belief, or had a notion, that maybe these were sex slurs put upon him by somebody who was looking into his background to maybe discredit him. And so he mentioned the fact that he thought he was being tailed to a guy named James Ridgway, who at the time was a reporter for the New Republic. Ridgway did some digging and was actually able to find out that, yes, in fact, General Motors, there was somebody tailing him. It was General Motors. He broke the story, and it just created an immediate splash. Now, at this time, Nader was doing very sort of quiet, not particularly closely followed testimony before Congress on the topic of auto safety. And when the story was broken that Ralph Nader had been tailed by these spies, the person who oversaw the congressional committee before which Ralph Nader was testifying demanded that the president of GM appear before the subcommittee to apologize for harassing a congressional witness. And this set up an incredible and dramatic David and Goliath confrontation where this diligent, hardworking, serious private citizen had been wronged by the largest corporation in the world, and the president of the company, James Roach, went before Congress and on national television apologized to Ralph Nader. In an instant, he was someone who people had heard of, people were talking about, and of course, even for that, he would have been simply an historical footnote had it not been for the fact that he kind of grabbed that event, grabbed that bit of profile that he gained, and just ran with it. And what I want to talk about tonight, after giving that sort of thumbnail sketch of his early years, is a period from about 1966, not long after the publication of Unsafe at Any Speed, which then did go high up on the bestseller list, from a period of about mid-1966 through the early 1970s, during which Ralph Nader was ascendant. And as a biographer, for me, one of the great pleasures and also one of the great challenges is trying to sort of make sense of a bygone era, of a time that's kind of lost in history. And it's almost impossible to overstate how important, what a huge figure Ralph Nader was during this era. And there's several factors that come into play, and wanted to spend some time discussing them before reading an excerpt that relates to that particular period. The first of them was that during this era, he just had an incredible grasp of how to work with the media. And he was just superb at cultivating reporters like Morton Mintz, a reporter for the Washington Post, Jack Morris, somebody at the New York Times. He had a superb ability to figure out what their deadlines were, what their needs were, what their territory was, how to deliver information to them in a timely fashion. He was a great tactician with the media. One of his greatest tactics was the weekend interview. You certainly couldn't reach a CEO over the weekend. A reporter certainly couldn't reach a member of Congress over the weekend, but Ralph Nader was available over weekends, and as a consequence, Sunday and Monday papers, slow news days, were often sprinkled with Ralph Nader stories. He was also a absolutely superb phrase maker. Ralph Nader came up with phrases during that era such as crime in the suites to refer to corporate crime versus crime in the streets. At one point, he did an investigation to the fat content on the nutritional labels of hot dogs and hamburgers, and he came up with the phrases fatfurters and shamburgers. And these phrases were picked up in places like Newsweek and Time Magazine. Now, plenty of other people during this era were muckraking, just as Nader was, but because they didn't have the same capacity for phrase making, they were overlooked. Another great Nader tactic, was the prepackaged story. He put together a set of materials that gave his perspective on a matter. Then he'd write down the name and phone numbers of people who were likely to reiterate his perspective. Then he'd write down a couple names and phone numbers of people who were likely to rebut his perspective. Then he'd go and hand deliver it to a lazy reporter who would then just turn off their brain, make a few phone calls, read the materials, prepackaged story. Bear in mind also that during this period of ascendancy for Ralph Nader, it was pre-Watergate. And before Watergate, a lot of newspapers didn't really provide the same level of resources for investigative reporting. It just wasn't the kind of venture that it became after Watergate. Meanwhile, Ralph Nader was off doing things like going down to West Virginia, looking into black lung disease among the miners. And so you could have somebody at a major metropolitan daily who the paper was unwilling to spring them to go off to West Virginia for a month. But if they just reported on Ralph Nader and his doings, they could be kind of a muckraker by proxy. And there was a lot of that in this era. One other thing that really struck me with respect to the media, in the course of doing my research, I had to look at literally almost every day's worth of the New York Times and Washington Post from during this era. And regularly, Ralph Nader would be on the front page 2 or 3 times a week in these major metropolitan dailies. And often, all that the story was a dutiful recounting of a press conference that Ralph Nader had held. It would just say, Ralph Nader held a press conference today to discuss the fact that the wicks in a certain kind of candle have the risk of throwing lead into the environment or into the air. And at the end of the story would have a little bit of dutiful rebuttal where, the American Candle Making Association says Ralph Nader's all wet. He's up to his old tactics again. But it was incredible. I mean, he called a press conference, front page of the Washington Post, front page of the New York Times. The fact that Ralph Nader was in the media, was so ever-present in the media, guaranteed that Congress would pay attention to him. Now, part of this is just good old-fashioned enlightened self-interest. Senators knew that if Ralph Nader testified before their committee, that the cameras would be there, the press would be there with their notebooks, and maybe if they said something, maybe it would get beamed back to the constituents back home. Nader was also, for the same reasons that he was such a talented, that he had such a grasp of how to make phrases that were picked up by the media, he also was really good in congressional testimony for many of the same reasons. Great phrase maker. He had sort of an air of controlled outrage that he was able to communicate. And I remember when I was doing my research, I spoke with a person who was a legislative aide to Teddy Kennedy back in the late 1960s. And he told me that he had this incredible coup where he managed to get Paul Newman to come before Congress to testify. And he expected this would be great, that this would go off very well. But Paul Newman proved to really be very poor at testimony. He was a movie star, but he did not have the seriousness or the gravitas. Nader had that, and that made him, again, an excellent, it made him very sought after during that era to testify before Congress. It's something that these days he barely ever appears before Congress at all. In this era, it was not unusual for him to appear before various subcommittees once or twice a week. He's also, as he was with the media, he was a great tactician with Congress. And one of his great techniques was to call up a senator and say, or meet a senator and say, Mr. Senator, would it be possible for me to make the introduction of one of your staff people? And the senator was happy to oblige. And then as now, senators are busy making public appearances, trying to get reelected, but it's often the staff people that have their fingers in the nitty-gritty details. They're the ones who might set the legislative agenda. They're the ones who are considering a bill, how and what form it may be considered and what form it might be passed. So in effect, by meeting a senator and saying, and sort of networking down, saying, can I get to know your staff person, he then in turn got to know a person who then could influence the senator in a very substantial and significant way. One more great Nader tactic was the patented late-night phone call. And Ralph Nader had no compunction about calling a senator at 2 or 3 in the morning. Now, CEOs wouldn't do that. Certainly you would not get a call in the middle of the night from another senator. But Ralph Nader did, and it did a lot towards communicating that here was this guy who was a public servant. And members of Congress, of course, hope to be or perceive themselves as public servants. Well, here was a guy who'd call you in the middle of the night. Things were so urgent, he couldn't wait till the next morning. And it's worked very, very effective technique. Walter Mondale, who has just tried to become a senator once again last week when he ran from Minnesota, was someone who worked very closely with Ralph Nader back in the 60s, particularly on the Wholesale Meat Act in 1967. And Mondale used to get calls in the middle of the night, and he got into the habit of just picking up the phone saying, "Hi, Ralph." Now, the fact that he was a media darling and the fact that he had this incredible profile before Congress guaranteed that Ralph Nader would get a ton of mail. And the mail was an amazing resource for him because it gave him a way of really having his finger on the pulse of the populace and what ailed the populace in terms of consumer problems. He would get mail that said, a particular model of car was a lemon. He'd get mail that said from people who said that they were experiencing a certain type of insurance fraud. And so he'd get a real read on what kinds of problems were out there. He also got a lot of letters, often anonymous letters, in which people revealed that they were in which people acted as whistleblowers, in which they wrote to him and said, I work in such and so plant. I just wanted to alert you about a practice at our plant that threatens the workers or threatens the environment or what have you. Now, during this era, Ralph Nader headed up an organization called the Center for the Study of Responsive Law. It still exists today, and he still heads it up. People that were somewhat intrepid would figure out that this was his organization, and they'd learn the address, and they'd send him a piece of mail at the Center for the Study of Responsive Law. Of course, a lot of other people couldn't figure that out necessarily or didn't bother to, but they might read an article in the Time magazine or Newsweek, a profile that mentioned that his family still lived in Winsted, Connecticut. So his family in Winsted got a huge volume of mail that said, please forward this on to Ralph Nader. And his mother would dutifully go through the letters and mark them up, read this, Ralph, ignore this one, and send them on to him in Washington. Other people simply just took a stab in the dark and wrote Ralph Nader, Washington, D.C., or Ralph Nader, Senator, Washington, D.C., which wasn't even true. Yet a huge number of these letters still made it to Ralph Nader, who then, during this era, he occupied a sort of crumbling Victorian-era mansion near DuPont Circle. And all around the mansion was sort of a haphazard effort to catalog and categorize these different letters that came in. So there were piles for bum toaster ovens and piles for, lemon Volkswagens and so forth. Now, during this era, too, there were just a huge number of people who wanted to work for Ralph Nader. And he ended up hiring these teams of mostly young people who would go off and do often concurrent investigations of all kinds of different instances of fraud and malfeasance. He'd have people looking into the doings of various corporations such as DuPont and what was then called First National City Bank. He had people looking into what were then very corrupt government agencies such as the FTC. He had them looking into topics such as land use in California. And he had often several hundred people working for him, as many at times as 1,000. And they were dubbed the Nader's Raiders. And it was incredible. When they were done doing their various muckraking crusades, they would typically produce a report. And these reports were published and appeared in bookstores, sometimes were bestsellers, got a lot of attention, and they were produced, in this case, often by people who were fresh out of college. Now, one thing that's very notable about the Nader's Raiders is most of them, for the most part, they were young white men. And the reason for this is very simple. Ralph Nader, at this point, was making a lot of speeches, often at law schools, which provided his primary recruiting pool for Nader's Raiders. And during this era, most of the people in law school were young white men. Of course, another issue that comes into play here is during this era, there were some other competing areas that someone of an activist bent might want to go into. Civil rights movement, the women's movement. And of course, people that were interested in those issues gravitated towards that, away from Ralph Nader, who didn't really delve into those areas. Another thing that's notable about the young white men, the predominantly young white men who came to work for Ralph Nader, is often they were from very wealthy families or they had family money. The reason for this is simple too. Ralph Nader paid virtually nothing when he could, and when he could, paid nothing at all if he could get someone to volunteer. And so you have some Nader's Raiders from that era. And of course, to be able to go and work for Ralph Nader, spend time in Washington, somebody had to have, if he was going to pay nothing or if he was going to pay a very small amount, someone often had to have some family money. And so some Nader's Raiders from this era include William Howard Taft IV, the great-grandson of the president, the one-time president, and he was certainly a person of means. Another Nader's Raider from this era was Edward Cox, who was one of his forefathers had been a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a few years later, Edward Cox married Patricia Nixon in a ceremony with a lot of hoopla, and Ralph Nader actually attended that ceremony. So basically, you have during this period, which you could describe sort of as Nader's golden age, from the mid-1960s after the publication of Unsafe at Any Speed, up through the mid-1970s, you have just a period when he is ascendant. And it's a sort of a glorious symbiosis. He had a great command of the media. Congress was at his beck and call. The mail was pouring in, and tons of young people wanted to work with him. And so I wanted to read an excerpt from my book that kind of, when I did the research and learned about this particular sort of lost episode in Nader's history or in his past, it just struck me that this particular episode reflected Nader at just the top of his powers. And so I will take a big gulp of water, and then I'll read that. On November 20th, 1969, Nader delivered a speech at Miss Porter's school in Farmington, Connecticut. It was arranged by Robert Townsend, a former CEO of Avis Rent-A-Car. His daughter, Claire Townsend, was a student there. Miss Porter's is an exclusive girls' finishing school, founded in 1843 and steeped in white glove tradition. Among its notable alumna, quaintly referred to as the Ancients, are Jackie Onassis and Letitia Baldridge, the noted expert on etiquette. As for Robert Townsend, he was a great admirer of Nader. Like Nader, Townsend was a dedicated corporate reformer. Though as a one-time CEO, he approached the topic from a vastly different perspective. When Townsend took over Avis in 1962, it had not turned a profit in 13 years. Townsend leveled hierarchies and freed up communications among the employees. His management style was a timely mix of the industrial age and the Aquarian age, and it succeeded in reinvigorating the company. Townsend's 1970 book, Up the Organization, is a classic of contrarian management advice. He would also serve as a major financial backer for various Nader projects in years to come. Nader's Miss Porter School appearance was extremely successful. The school, like Avis and just about every other institution in America, was going through tremendous upheaval in 1969. Among the 230 girls present for Nader's speech were a number who had older brothers serving in Vietnam. Many were also starting to question the prescribed roles they were expected to play in the course of their lives. Debutante, society wife, wealthy dowager, perhaps. The wider world was sneaking across the manicured lawns of Miss Porter's school. Lally Lloyd was a student at the school in 1969. She attended Nader's speech and has the following recollection. He's a very passionate speaker, and he got us all very stirred up. We became excited about the idea of what it was that we could accomplish as consumers and as citizens. Following the speech, girls flocked around Nader. He was besieged by questions. The girls wanted to know what they could do, how they could fix what ailed society. They wanted to be raiders. That night, Claire Townsend filled her diary with reactions to the big speech, interweaving impassioned notions about how to make the world a better place with assorted observations about Nader himself. First impression, tall, thin, gaunt. Second impression, shy, nervous. Third impression, funny and nice. Fourth impression, witty, intelligent, articulate, and concise. Back in Washington, Nader mulled over his exuberant reception at Miss Porter's school. Was there a project, he wondered, that would be manageable and appropriate for teenage girls? How could he channel all that youthful energy and idealism? Then it hit him, nursing homes. Teenagers frequently worked as orderlies, and the subject matter, abuse of the elderly, was far less demanding than much Nader fare. Nader selected 5 girls, Claire Townsend and Lally Lloyd among them, to spend the summer in D.C., conducting an investigation of nursing homes. Margaret Quinn, a 25-year-old teacher at Miss Porter's, would accompany the girls as a chaperone. This was a strange new subspecies of Nader raider, teenage and female, but also impossibly privileged. From the latter standpoint, they bore a marked resemblance to the initial 7, Cox, Taft Four et al., who had investigated the FTC. Claire Townsend, besides being the daughter of a corporate chieftain, lived in exclusive Locust Valley, Long Island. Lally Lloyd was from a tony Philadelphia suburb and had been born into an investment banking dynasty. Her father worked for Drexel Burnham Lambert, the firm her great-grandfather had founded. A bemused press dubbed the 5 the Maiden Muckrakers. In an interview with the New York Times Magazine, Nader explained the logic in hiring a team of teenagers, in quotes. The nursing home project did not require the kind of specialized legal and accounting knowledge that investigating, say, First National City Bank does. There's also a great deal of suffering in nursing homes, and the industry is saturated with government involvement. I feel society is tested by compassion, by its treatment of the very young and the very old. So there was a tremendous symbolic reason I wanted young people on the project. And why young people with such manifest privilege? In quotes, there have been all kinds of investigations of nursing homes and the problems of the aged, but they weren't really dramatic. With Claire and the girls, it would be the very young reaching out to the very old. And here also were young, pretty, rich girls from Jackie Onassis' school, and I felt that what these girls did would be noticed. Off went the Maiden Muckrakers, chaperone in tow, to spend the summer in Washington. As a rule, Nader interns, even those who had family money, tended to choose suitably seedy accommodations for the summer. They might crash on a friend's couch or rent a vacant dorm room at one of the city's many colleges. Not this group. Instead, Robert Townsend purchased a townhouse in southwest Washington so they could live in the style to which they are accustomed. The girls set up house, divvied up cooking nights and cleaning duties, and bought a mongrel dog they named Ralph. First order of business was finding jobs as aides and orderlies. The plan was for the 5 to split up and work sub rosa at various nursing homes. They would keep diaries of the atrocities they observed for use in a report. Here's a choice excerpt from Claire Townsend's diary. The nurse I was assigned to, Ethel, was so kind to some patients and so mean to others. It was especially cruel when the 2 extremes happened in the same room with 2 patients. While Ethel and I were putting the favored patient to bed, doing a lot of extra fussing and smiling and taking a long time, the other patient, who was sitting in a chair in her own filth, kept saying, "Girlie, please put me to bed." But I didn't know how to do it. I'd been given no orientation and no training whatsoever, even though I'd said I'd never done this type of work before. So I just stood there feeling helpless and horrible, waiting for Ethel. Finally, Ethel came over, dragged the woman out of the chair, slammed her against the bed, and began to undress her roughly. The old woman kept saying that she was slipping and about to fall, but Ethel just told her to shut up. Then Ethel swung the old woman into bed, threw the covers up over the woman's face, and left the room. Besides nosing around nursing homes and keeping diaries, Nader also wanted the girls to do some original research. He directed them to interview various experts in government and the elder care industry in order to gain a deeper understanding of the issues. This aspect of the project proved daunting. Lally Lloyd interviewed a specialist on for-profit nursing homes at the Securities and Exchange Commission. In quotes, "This guy knew perfectly well he could not resist an interview request from Ralph Nader," she recalls, "but he gave me nothing. I only got out of him what I knew enough to ask for, and I don't think I was as well-informed or well-prepared as I might have been." On another occasion, the girls tried to infiltrate a meeting of the American Nursing Home Association. Dressed in appropriate business attire, the five filed into the auditorium and took their seats. They thought they were being discreet, but they were also, quite visibly, the only teenage girls present. The next speaker to the stage blew their cover. "I understand we have some visitors here," he said. "Will the young ladies who are working for Ralph Nader please stand up?" The girls arranged a strategy session with Nader to learn how they might get better results. He gave them some tips on how to play rough with sources. One of his suggestions was to tell the interviewee that someone from a competing organization had promised the same information. In quotes, "I have a source who can have the information ready by next week, but I thought maybe you could give it to me now." As an alternate approach, Nader suggested the girls might try to shake these nursing home bureaucrats out of their complacency, really remind them of the true nature of their work. Nader suggested saying something along the lines of, "You seem to be caught up in quite a bit of paperwork here. Do you ever think about or even feel for the 1 million nursing home patients around the country?" The girls tried Nader's hardball strategies, but had limited success. What truly worked, at least in their case, was inviting sources over to the townhouse for dinner. They discovered that a home-cooked meal, enjoyed in the company of comely teenage girls, worked wonders at loosening people up. Dr. Robert Butler, a Washington psychiatrist who specialized in aged patients, stayed past midnight, a font of tips and leads and other useful pieces of information. The girls also tried to get Nader to come over for dinner. He was rather hesitant. Impropriety, the mere appearance of impropriety, had been a constant concern for him ever since the alleged GM Sexler incident. In the intervening years, his list of enemies had only grown. He had no doubt that there were powerful interests out there who would love to get some dirt. Dining with teenage girls, he felt, had limited potential to be twisted or misconstrued. Nader told the girls that maybe he would accept their invitation. If so, he would give them exactly 26 hours' notice. The girls puzzled over this strange choice. Why 26 hours? One day, late in the summer, Nader called the girls' house. Claire Townsend answered. It was 5 p.m. Nader said he had decided to accept their dinner offer, expect him the next evening at 7 o'clock. 26 hours. The girls never did figure out the reason for this quirk. As one-time raider Andrew Eggendorf noted, Nader liked to conduct his life like a spy. As for playing the menu, it proved quite a challenge. During their phone conversation, Claire asked Nader if he would like a chicken dish. No. Oh, she pursued, well, do you like any kind of meat? No. Are you a vegetarian? No, but just about to become one. I see. What do you like? Tomatoes, onions, and squash. Uh-huh. What do you like to drink? Do you like wine? No. Milk? No. Water? No, neither would you if you knew what was in it. Well, what do you like? Grapefruit juice. The girls pored over a Betty Crocker cookbook until they came across a recipe calling for tomatoes, onions, squash, eggplant, and green peppers. They also consulted with a Lebanese friend who helped fix tabbouleh. Upon sitting down to dinner, Nader said grace in Arabic, a big hit. By all accounts, he quite enjoyed his home-cooked Middle Eastern meal prepared by 5 Connecticut prep school girls. He did not stay past midnight. At the close of the summer, the Maid Muckrakers participated in a rite already undertaken by a number of other Nader teams. They wrote a report entitled Old Age, The Last Segregation that was 229 pages long. The bulk of it consisted of diary entries recounting the grisly episodes the team members had witnessed while working undercover in various nursing homes. Nader predicted that the project would be dramatic and garner attention, and it did. Reviews were overwhelmingly favorable, though with some reservations. The consensus held that the passages from the diaries were the most effective part of the book. They provided a fresh-eyed look at the human suffering that existed in nursing homes, an issue to which many supposed pundits had grown inured. Otherwise, it was agreed, the book broke little new ground. The public policy recommendations were unimaginative, merely rehashings of ideas in the existing literature. Then again, the authors were teenage girls. The 5 also got a chance to testify before Congress. They appeared before the Senate Subcommittee on Long-Term Care's Special Committee on Aging, chaired by Frank Moss of Utah. Before their testimony, while waiting around outside the Senate committee room, the girls started to get a bit giggly. Nader shushed them. Above all, he cautioned, you must be serious. Thank you. And I have a question.
Peer, you mentioned the Nader's Raiders. What about the Peers, P-I-R-G? Do you just limit your book to 85? Is there a time limit in your book?
No, it's
What happened after the time you mentioned?
Sure. Well, it's no. The book is a cradle to present book, and the Pergs were something that he started in 1970, if I remember correctly, and they're public interest research groups. That's right, and very very strange. Maybe Nader's strangest concept ever, and also his most enduring. They still exist today. Many people might know they're. I think they operate now in 26 states. Basically, Public Interest Research Group was the name of a law firm he founded, and he decided to franchise it, kind of like Kentucky Fried Chicken. And his notion was that if he could set up law firms near campuses, near university campuses, that would work in conjunction with the students on issues that they were interested in, like fighting to keep from disrupting the migratory patterns of salmon, or fighting to keep a nuclear plant from being built in the state, that these law firms could sort of combine the professional ability of lawyers with the idealism of students. And so, and the way they would be financed is out of the student activity fee. If the campus voted to have a PERG, then what would happen is out of the student activity fee, which also pays for the football team and visiting guest lecturers and so forth, they would finance a PERG. And he started going around the country trying to sort of lobbying for this concept in the late 60s and early 70s. And it was sort of a high water mark, probably about the mid to late 70s, when there were a huge number of PERGs at a huge number of campuses around the country. And today there's still, if I remember correctly, 26 states that have campuses that work with the PERGs. So it's a bizarre concept that was also very, I guess, well thought out in a way, and it continues to this day. You.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I actually wonder what, if you, in the research for your book, if you came upon anything about his orientation towards the Vietnam War. Obviously, that was the height of his popularity, sort of, as you described, but it seems, did he ever use his popularity to sort of take a position towards the war, or talk about that much at all?
Absolutely not. It was a very conscious and careful decision on his part. As a great tactician, he has always avoided getting involved in issues that are well served by other people. And there was a very vibrant, fully formed anti-Vietnam movement, and he resisted. He was constantly called upon to join this movement, to lend his good name to it, as it were. And he refused, and his reason was he really wanted to concentrate on what was narrow and also very broad, which was consumerism. And he would regularly make comments when he was called upon to defend his conspicuous absence from being a Vietnam protester. He would often respond that as many people are killed on the highways in a given year, more people were killed on the highways in a given year, even there in that era, than had been killed in the Vietnam War so far. So he was concentrating on a place that he would say where great carnage was taking place. So no, he was always very willful and very careful, canny in avoiding becoming involved in things like civil rights, the Vietnam War, etc. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a question about the actual writing of the book. The fact that he's a very private person is sort of well publicized. And so how did you go about actually, getting permission to write the book and get the interviews with him and so forth? And how was that?
The interviews went very well. I did a sort of a classic biographer's technique, which was I started researching the book without permission, and I simply I got permission from my publisher, which meant that I had some reason to go out and start with this undertaking. And I sent a request to him early in the going, and it took a while for him to respond. And in the meantime, I just started interviewing tons and tons of people who'd worked with him over the years. One thing that's sort of notable about Ralph Nader is he's rubbed shoulders with and worked with thousands and thousands of people. He's also parted ways poorly with the vast majority of them. It's incredible. He really clashes with a lot of his former employees. And by virtue of that, there was a huge pool of people out there who were comfortable talking about him and quite willing to talk about him. The 2000 election, furthermore, alienated a lot of his. I mean, many former Naderites, many former Nader-raters are Democrats. Some of them are Republicans. Any of those folks were happy to talk. People, I felt, many people kind of got their start with him. He sort of shaped their view of advocacy that they're carrying through to this day. So people weren't necessarily negative about him, but they were comfortable talking about the good and the bad because, people sort of passed through his organization. As not too many people have stuck with him over the many years. So there's a huge number of people out there who have Nader experience, as it were. So I started by talking to a lot of them, and then gradually, when it became clear to him, I guessed that I was, doing a serious, that I wasn't trying to do a hatchet job or anything like that. He was comfortable and was willing to talk with me. And you had a question?
Well, you described this great legacy that he has of the 60s and even into the 70s. What do you, maybe you wrote this in the book, I don't know, but what do you think will be the legacy of his experience with the Green Party?
Good question. His first and foremost, he may not even, it would not surprise me if he ran for president again. It would not surprise me if he ran for president not as a member of the Green Party. One thing that's interesting is he never joined the Green Party, even though he's their presidential candidate. He likes to hold himself vigorously independent. He's never been a Democrat, certainly never been a Republican. He's never been a Green either. So, and the Green, it was kind of a marriage of convenience between Nader and the Greens. The Greens needed someone who had a national stature. And if you look at the recent election, you'll see that a lot of the people that the Greens field as candidates, their names are fairly anonymous. And so Nader's really their one, their superstar, basically. So they needed him in order to have a viable candidate with great name recognition. He needed them to make use of their party machinery and the people they had on the ground. And they actually didn't really see eye to eye on a huge number of issues. I'll give you one funny one that happened at the nominating convention. Nader and his crew at the nominating convention believed that there should be green balloons, and their point was balloons are presidential. The Green Party felt that birds might choke on them. And so they had this big clash back and forth, and ultimately Nader won, and he was able to have green balloons. But throughout the election, there's a lot of internal, the Greens are a very fractious group to begin with in any case. And throughout the election, there was a real, Nader basically hijacked their party in order to run for president. But his big issue is the way that corporations pervert the democratic process, which it's kind of like a Venn diagram. It has some correspondence with the Green Party's issues, but the Green Party is also into a lot of issues such as obviously the environment and so forth, which Nader is not that great of an environmentalist, and when he is interested in environment, it usually has to do with how corporations, he's not someone who goes out and loves and appreciates nature. So basically, the Greens and Nader, marriage of convenience is the best way to describe it. And as for their legacy, I'm not sure that they'll be too associated for too much longer.
One of those people I think you alluded to, I really admired him and loved his politics. I helped bring him to my law school 20 years ago. I was head of DC PERG, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm really furious at him for what he did in 2000. I am furious at him, and I think the elections the other night come out of the fact that he gave the election to Bush. And I just don't, I had a lunch day with a guy who used to work for him, and we always knew about the issue of how he supposedly treated his workers. That was another thing that always bothered me. You might want to touch on that. But I just thought his politics were so great. He did so many great things, and I think he's going to be remembered for, in large part, for the 2000 election. I understand his reasoning. He wanted to build a more progressive movement, et cetera, et cetera. But for such a brilliant guy to say there's no difference between, I guess, what we would have had under Gore and under Bush, maybe some people would disagree. I just don't understand it. And Gore wouldn't have even needed Florida. He would have won in New Hampshire if Nader hadn't. So, and we saw months later, and he's still unrepentant. He tells the New York Times he's unrepentant. There's no difference. Well, there's plenty of difference with the Supreme Court and with war in Iraq, etc. And what was he thinking? Why did he do it?
Yeah, I guess I'll take the last piece of it. What was he thinking? Why did he do it? He was somebody who, the period that I described in the little sort of speech I did there from the late 60s to the early 70s, he was like a shadow congressional whip, basically. He was more effective than most members of Congress, and he was very effective working within the political process. Then you have through the 80s with Reagan as president and later with Bush 1 as president, you have Nader really fading from view, not really able to get those audiences with Congress anymore. He starts trying to figure out different things he can do at the grassroots, working with the PIRGs in some cases and so forth. And ultimately, he concludes that he is going to run for president. And so I guess that's the why he did it. As for whether it was a good thing, whether it'll be a blight on his record, I guess the answer to that is he's one of the, my answer to that would be, he's one of the youngest 68-year-olds you'll ever encounter. His hero is a guy named Norman Thomas, who ran for president 6 times as a socialist. Final time that Norman Thomas ran, he got 10,000 votes, but he kept at it. And I think that, I know this is the classic F. Scott Fitzgerald comment that, there are no second acts in American life. Nader is young enough yet and energetic enough. I wouldn't be surprised if he had a third or even fourth act. That's my own candid opinion.
This is sort of following up on that. I noticed on the book it says Crusader. I was going to say if you would go into the spoiler, or I know he asked that.
Sure.
Do you have more? Could you elaborate a little bit more on this spoiler? And also, does he have any sense of humor?
That's a great. I'll take the first question first because I love that. I love that question. I've done 2 biographies now. The first one was Alan Greenspan, and the second one was Ralph Nader. And one thing I can tell you about anybody you do, particularly serious people, if they're your biography subjects, the little secret thing that people try to tell you about them, the sort of thing you might not know, is that they're secretly a really funny guy. Well, I can tell you, Alan Greenspan is not a funny guy, and Ralph Nader is not a funny guy. So, and people point to, he's had a whole lifetime. He's occasionally said so. He's clever, and he's angry and clever, but he certainly lacks the empathy to be a stand-up comedian or anything. So that's the first part of the question. The more serious part, yes, the spoiler. Well, let's see. I guess Nader has given all kinds of contradictory answers to whether he was a spoiler, and I guess I would have to say myself, my own personal view, which is not probably really all that important, is that anybody should be able to run for president. And I guess to quote Ralph Nader, he said, Al Gore slipped on 15 banana peels. I was one of them. And I personally buy that. I feel like if Gore had run a better campaign, Nader would have been a non-factor. Maybe even Nader would be someone people were pleased he was there, sort of pushing Gore back to the left more. But to speak to sort of the deeper point of him being a spoiler, he's certainly unrepentant, as people have pointed out. He's gleeful. He has a gleeful hatred for the Democrats, a gleeful hatred for Gore. He's also said a huge number of very contradictory things. One thing that he's certainly made mention of periodically, I saw him at a Green Party function where he talked about, he didn't describe it in so many terms, but it's sort of this notion that if you push the pendulum far to the right, then it'll swing back wonderfully to the left, which is kind of a silly way to look at history because it means make things bad so they'll become good again. And so he kind of takes credit for, when things go bad, he actually, and he actually calls up, I interviewed an old friend of his from Princeton who he calls up periodically because, can you believe this John Ashcroft, and he's sort of, without any irony or sense of, well, maybe I had some role in there being this John Ashcroft. So I guess one thing that's certainly the case is anybody has a right to run for president, in my view at least, and you can certainly look, in fact, and see that Harry Brown, the Libertarian candidate, he took more than 535 votes from Bush in Florida. So technically, Harry Brown is a spoiler as well. But what distinguishes Harry Brown from Nader is Harry Brown was just out there, libertarian, talking about driving fast and smoking pot, and those were his issues, and he hewed to that. Whereas Nader was very gleeful about wanting to attack Gore. He aimed a lot more firepower at Gore than he did at Bush. And he's been unrepentant in the aftermath and made many contradictory comments, including the ones at which he thrills at the contradiction, the fact that the Republicans are in power, so maybe the pendulum will swing back the other way. So the net of that is spoiler is certainly part of his legacy.
It's referring strictly to the 2000, because that's what I want to know.
That's a good question. It actually isn't. It's actually referring to an interesting period. I mean, it's obviously referring to the 2000 election, but I wanted to sort of identify the origins of his playing spoiler. And strangely enough, when Jimmy Carter became president, you would think that would be Nader's golden moment. And instead, it was the beginning of the end for him as a figure as powerful as he was in the 60s. Because what happened was the government was flooded. I mean, Jimmy Carter met with Nader several times after being elected president, before becoming president, during the transition period. And he met with him and showed a great obeisance. I mean, he said, what should I do? Who can I bring into the government? And Carter actually listened to Nader and brought a huge number of Nader associates and former Nader raiders into the government. And what did Nader do? He attacked his former colleagues and said, why can't you get this done? Why can't you do this fast enough? And so people who should have been his allies in government, instead he completely alienated them. And the Carter administration, most people date the beginning of his decline to the Reagan era, but the Carter administration, Nader was so churlish and so difficult with his former colleagues in government that nothing got done, and at that point he sort of played spoiler to his own movement, as it were.
Remember they used to refer to this in English literature to the four humors, and he sounds like bilious.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's an apt description, yes.
I think it's interesting. In the course of your discussion, you were saying that he wasn't able to get support from people supporting the civil rights movement or the women's movement. You said he didn't care much about the environment. I mean, I think the reason he can be gleeful is that he doesn't care very much about things that are very, very important to a lot of people in this country. And it's all well and good for him to be gleeful and act as spoiler, but these issues are of enormous relevance to so many people in this country. I think he bears a great weight of responsibility, and I think he should be ashamed of himself.
Yeah. Well, you're dead on what you say. I mean, there's certainly something about Nader, which is he's distant. He's removed. He likes to have it's a theoretical criticism of how corporations are perverting democracy. But then when it gets down to actual people and their daily lives, he has a bad track record on the opinions he's expressed. When he ran for the Green, this is his second time around, 2000, as the Green Party candidate. He actually ran in 1996. And one of the Green Party platforms at that point was a gay marriage platform. And William Safire interviewed him about this, and Ralph Nader's response was, "I'm not interested in gonadal politics." And that, as you might imagine, really stuck in the craw of a lot of gay people. In fact, in 2000, when he ran again, a lot of gay people who were Greens actually broke away, annoyed remembering the gonadal politics comment. During the 2000 election, it was pointed out to him that if, in fact, Bush was elected, that it was possible that Bush would nominate certain justices who might start to eke away at or even ultimately overturn Roe versus Wade. And Nader's response on I can't remember the talk show, but on a national talk show was, well, if Roe versus Wade is overturned, it reverts to the states, which is from a pure legal standpoint, absolutely true. That's right. If it was overturned, the state of New York could continue to have abortions be legal. The state of Alabama could make them illegal. But to make a comment like that if Roe versus Wade were overturned, it would revert to the states, showed a real legalistic mind at work. And it didn't think about the fact, well, that would be of immense anxiety to a lot of people. And in certain states where it would be quickly overturned or the overturning of it would be upheld, bad news. So, yeah.
A wealthy white man's movement. Those were his raiders.
Yeah, it's a classic criticism of the Nader's raiders, and then it's a classic criticism, as many people might know, of the Green Party, interestingly enough, as well. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I actually just like to speak to that point because I think it's an interesting one. I mean, is the conception that all wealthy white men should be Republicans then? I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, as, a professional white man, I take exception to the comment that, again, somehow wealthy or well-off white people shouldn't be working on behalf of the rights of workers or the environment and whatnot. So I just think that, that comment, I'm not exactly sure what the proper response is to.
Yeah, that's a fair. I mean, certainly it was good that he had people working for him, and they were doing good. They were helping, and some of them later became Republicans. Actually, a surprising number of them did. So it wasn't as if these were future Republicans doing good things on these various issues. But I guess it is also notable that he's certainly. There's an elitist element to him, which is notable. He went to Princeton, went on to Harvard, and he's always been interested to give an example, he's never been interested in getting involved in the messy stuff, civil rights, gay rights, what have you. He's always preferred to have clean-cut, young, often white men rifling through the files of an obscure government agency, trying to find out about what corruption is involved there, which is a worthy pursuit and much more worthy than other things that other people are doing of all races and creeds. But it is notable that he's never wanted to get his hands messy in some of these other issues. So.
If, as you indicate, that he's currently still that concerned about corporate ethics, I think what we've seen the past several months with Enron, WorldCom, and so on, these would be tailor-made issues for him. Why has he been, it appears to me, conspicuously silent? Is it lack of credibility because of the 2000 election, which I, largely agree with this gentleman over there, that he had inflicted enormous damage on this country simply by causing Bush.
Great question.
I might just say parenthetically that I've heard through a number of interviews his stock phrase is, well, how could you do this with so much at stake in the country and the world? You cost Al Gore that 1% that would have made the difference in this large state and so on. And his response, very sarcastically, has always been, no, it's actually that Al Gore cost me 48%.
Mm-hmm. Yep, no, that's he likes to say that. That's a favorite, a chestnut for him. I'll speak to your question, which is a very good one, which is why what a tailor-made, as you said, WorldCom, Tyco, Enron, Martha Stewart, the list goes on and on. Why is he so conspicuously absent? I actually talked to him about that, one of the last interviews I had with him. He said he just can't get any traction. For one thing, if he was to become involved in these issues, one thing he would necessarily need to do is work with Congress. And he can't work with Congress anymore. He lost that constituency a long, long time ago. Another interesting thing worth noting is because he set in motion an entire movement that seeks to look at acts of corporate malfeasance and crime and so forth, there are other people that have sort of picked up the mantle for him, and so there are other organizations out there that kind of maybe Nader set in motion, which are on the case. The final thing is definitely, as you say, there's a credibility gap that hurts him, that makes it difficult for him to get involved in this. He's been trying to put together what he calls a citizens coalition on Enron to get real substantive stuff done, as he terms it, versus the sort of the window dressing that Congress has been undertaking. But it hasn't made much of a ripple at this point.
He still believes the two parties are exactly the same.
Does he believe that? Yes.
Light of all the corporate malfeasance that's transpired the past several months, he's still fixed on that.
No, he still believes that they're very close together. So, yes.
So painted a picture of a man who's very interested in a narrow issue. He, corporate malfeasance, consumer advocacy, right? And he used to be involved in Vietnam, anti-Vietnam demonstration, civil rights. So what was all of a sudden the propulsion? What was the impulse that? It's like, okay, so he specialized on something. What was the impulse that had him seek this sort of a national office, to wanting to broaden away? In fact, you do have to care about a much broader spectrum of issues. What was...
Good question. Well, he expanded his critique. His critique has always been that corporations, he originally viewed it as the producers versus the consumers. And he felt that the balance was tilted in America. Producers had too much power and consumers had too little power. He was trying to seek to redress the balance. He would say that he simply broadened his critique to include the fact that corporations not only were hurting consumers of goods and services, but hurting the consumers of our democracy. And basically it was just a broadening or expanding of this is how he would justify his choice to run for president, that things like campaign finance reform, a huge issue, of course, that corporations were buying members of Congress, basically, and so they were perverting democracy. That the same corporations that once upon a time the biggest danger they posed was faulty cars, such as the Chevrolet Corvair, that they are now actually posing as a threat to democracy. And that would be his argument, and that was his justification for running. Of course, the fascinating thing was once he ran, that was his focus issue, and all the other issues that come with being a national leader, issues like Roe versus Wade, gay rights, you name it. He was very tone deaf on all of those, and so he wasn't very well positioned to take up the huge ball of wax that most presidential candidates have to consider and be able to speak to. I actually have only 2 more questions, so I should see if anybody else has a fresh one.
You studied him. I'm thinking rigid, intolerant, judgmental. What would be the 3 adjectives you would use to describe him?
Well, I'd pick one of those, and I'd probably say maybe judgmental, but I'd also say relentless. And I'd also say, it's not necessarily an adjective, I'd say brilliant tactician. He's he was a big chess player back in high school, and he's often described his work as playing 50 games of chess simultaneously, and I actually believe that in his mind, it's probably kind of what he's doing. incredible tactician, and although he is the things you mentioned, and also I believe relentless, there's a good reason why, here 40 years since he first came to national prominence, I mean, you can't find a rock star who lasted that long. You can't find a movie star who's been around that long. You can find Strom Thurmond, but otherwise you got Ralph Nader. So it's some of that tactician, that ability as a tactician, which has allowed him to go from being, as I described them earlier, a shadow congressional whip, to being a great grassroots organizer, to being to being a spoiler, yes. So, one last question, anybody?
Why would you say that Ralph was so successful in taking on Corvair and General Motors? How does a guy that didn't have a whole lot of power, much connection, why was he so successful? It seems to me that the newspapers could have ignored him, put it off. Was the car that bad? You may have just touched on it by saying he was a brilliant soldier or tactician, but what if you could comment on that?
The main thing was he was the benefit of just a great circumstance, and that was, I mean, people weren't, the topic of the faulty engineering of the Corvair, which was detailed appeared in great detail in Unsafe at Any Speed, before the spy scandal that happened in the aftermath of that, because General Motors is a very interesting thing. It was kind of the collision of two paranoid forces. General Motors was so paranoid that this book, that actually had they not done anything, it wouldn't have made much of a ripple. Down the line, probably these innovations would have happened, seatbelts and so forth. Various people would have gotten credit for them. Maybe Nader even would have played a role, but he wouldn't have been launched instantly onto the national stage had it not been for General Motors' paranoia about the fact that they'd been mentioned adversely in this book and the fact that they hired spies to tail him around. That created this big spy scandal. And then on the flip side of it, the fascinating thing is Nader himself has always been a very paranoid person, kind of kept his doings and goings very secret. And so that was part of the reason that the spies were tailing Nader. They were very puzzled by a lot of his strange behavior. The fact that he lived in a rooming house in downtown Washington, had an unlisted number where they'd call and somebody'd pick up the phone. Mysterious people would pick up the phone and say, "Phone's for you, Ralph." And he works at night and sleeps during the day during this era and all these things. And so you got paranoid General Motors clashing or coming together with paranoid Ralph Nader and wondering why this guy's so sneaky, and it just creates this incredible event that basically and it was a very charismatic or very compelling event that General Motors, which at that time was the biggest corporation in the world, that their CEO was called before Congress to apologize to a private citizen who at that point people didn't know much about him except, he's a diligent, serious young man, and General Motors put spies on his tail. So that was an easy thing for the press, which obviously needs, kind of sound bites to be able to grasp onto, David versus Goliath, Ralph Nader versus General Motors, and that launched him into national acclaim instantly. So, well, I think time's up here, but I thank everybody for coming out. It was a pleasure.
Justin Martin is author of Nader, Crusader Spoiler Icon. It's published by Perseus. Visit perseusbooks.com for
He worked on the assembly line of Maxwell Auto Company, and Maxwell Auto Company was later rechristened Chrysler. And when Ralph Nader was growing up, at the dinner table, he often was regaled by his father with stories of the degradations of working on the assembly line of Maxwell Auto Company, and people can make of it what they will as to whether that had any kind of influence in his later life as an auto safety crusader. Ralph Nader has two sisters, Claire and Laura. Claire Nader is a advocate kind of in a Ralph Nader type of vein. Her area of interest is genetic testing, patenting of genes, those types of issues, and as you can imagine, she's against it. Ralph Nader's other sister, Laura, is an anthropology professor at Berkeley, and Laura's area of expertise is victims' rights. Ralph Nader also had a brother named Shafiq. Shafiq was, when I interviewed people, they often described him as being to the town of Winsted, Connecticut, where they grew up, what Ralph Nader was to the rest of the country. He was a very vocal gadfly. He was always complaining at town meetings about the sewer system. He was always trying to shoot down various local ordinances. And Shafiq died in 1986. Ralph Nader went to Princeton University undergrad, and he attended at the same time as Donald Rumsfeld. And Rumsfeld at that time was kind of a big man on campus. He was on the wrestling team. And during one of my interviews with Ralph Nader, he described Rumsfeld as the...
Now, from Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C., Justin Martin discusses his new biography of consumer advocate and 2000 presidential candidate Ralph Nader. It's about an hour.
Please help me welcome Justin Martin.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here at Politics and Prose to talk about Ralph Nader, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. So look around the audience, I see some friendly faces, including my cousins who live here in Washington, D.C., and some old friends from college and other times in my life. So welcome everybody, and thanks for coming out. And thought what I'd do is I'd start by providing kind of a thumbnail sketch of Ralph Nader's early years. Then I'm going to talk for a while about a particular period in his history. Then I'll read a brief excerpt that relates to that period in time. And then I'll be happy to entertain any and all questions. We can talk about the 2000 election. We can talk about the 2002 midterms. Whatever people want to talk about, I'll be happy to entertain questions. So starting with the sort of brief thumbnail sketch of his early years, Ralph Nader was born on February 27, 1934 in Winsted, Connecticut. His parents were Lebanese immigrants, and his father, upon arriving in the United States, for 1 year before settling in Winsted, Connecticut, he lived in Detroit. And while he was in Detroit, mug wrestler. While Ralph Nader was at Princeton, he owned his last car he would ever drive, which was an old Studebaker. One time he was driving around on campus, and this kind of abstracted-looking man with flowing white hair kind of wandered out into the line of his car. Ralph Nader had to slam on the brakes. He stopped right before this person, looked up through his front window, and there standing before him was Albert Einstein. And he thought to himself, what if the brakes hadn't worked? I would have run over one of the great minds of the 20th century. And again, you can make of it what you will as to whether that had some influence on his later decision to become an auto safety crusader. He did get rid of the Studebaker not too long after that. Let's see, after Princeton undergrad, Ralph Nader went on to Harvard Law School. He never felt comfortable there. He never has had a sort of ambivalent relationship towards the school. And in the years since then, he's often described Harvard as a high-priced tool factory. Now after graduating Harvard Law, he went back to Connecticut, back to Hartford, and he practiced what can only be described as penny ante law. He was doing divorce cases, trust. He was in a little tiny firm with just one other person. He was doing some ambulance chasing even. It was just very low-level law. At the same time, he was developing an interest sort of as a sideline in a topic that at that time was very, very esoteric, which was the role that engineering could play in auto safety. And it's kind of hard to believe, but during this era, the prevailing belief was that all the engineering innovations possible had been made with respect to cars. The only thing that could be done, the only improvements that could be made, were for people to drive more carefully, safer driving. Ralph Nader was of the belief, and it was a fringe view, that maybe there are innovations, things that we've come to take for granted, like seat belts, safety glass, collapsible steering columns, that maybe if you could package drivers within the cars better, even if they're a sloppy driver, they might be saved in an accident. Now, in 1964, Ralph Nader got the opportunity to go down to Washington and work with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who's one of the handful of people who also subscribe to this kind of esoteric view about the role that engineering could play in safety. And while Ralph Nader was down in Washington working with Moynihan, he sort of laid the groundwork for Unsafe at Any Speed, which came out in the autumn of 1965. And looking back, people probably might think that Unsafe at Any Speed was just an instant sensation. But in fact, it was a very serious book. It was taken very seriously. It was reviewed in some places like Science Magazine and San Francisco Chronicle. And people sort of did a lot of discussion of how it was an important book, and it was destined to sink without a ripple had it not been for the fact that one of the parties named in the book, pointed to in the book, General Motors, was very concerned about Ralph Nader's pointing to them for their what he asserted was faulty engineering in the production of the Corvair. And so they assigned a couple of spies to tail him around Washington, D.C. Also, Nader had some strange experiences when he went into a Safeway at one point, also at a newsstand at one point, where he was accosted by women. And Ralph Nader had the belief, or had a notion, that maybe these were sex slurs put upon him by somebody who was looking into his background to maybe discredit him. And so he mentioned the fact that he thought he was being tailed to a guy named James Ridgway, who at the time was a reporter for the New Republic. Ridgway did some digging and was actually able to find out that, yes, in fact, General Motors, there was somebody tailing him. It was General Motors. He broke the story, and it just created an immediate splash. Now, at this time, Nader was doing very sort of quiet, not particularly closely followed testimony before Congress on the topic of auto safety. And when the story was broken that Ralph Nader had been tailed by these spies, the person who oversaw the congressional committee before which Ralph Nader was testifying demanded that the president of GM appear before the subcommittee to apologize for harassing a congressional witness. And this set up an incredible and dramatic David and Goliath confrontation where this diligent, hardworking, serious public-private citizen had been